Hey everyone, it's Jim Cohn. I'm here with my daughter Lulu.
Hi.
At the end of episode 10, I promised I would release some bonus material where David Sloan Wilson actually interviewed me instead of me interviewing David Sloan Wilson. And this is that material. I hope you enjoy it. Bye-bye.
Hello, this is David Sloan Wilson having a bourbon with Jim Cohn.
It's about time.
At the Association for Contextual Behavioral Sciences meeting. And as we will see from this interview, we're basically meeting in the middle from our different perspectives. And Jimmy interviewed me yesterday, so there's a long interview with me as to how I came to this intellectual spot. And now I'm going to turn the tables and interview Jim as to how he got here. And it has all to do with the intersection between evolution, psychology, and in your case, neuroscience.
Indeed it does, yeah.
It's basically all about integration over bourbon. And,
I think sort of life is all about that.
Yeah, exactly. And you do a lot of interviewing now.
I do. I talk with a lot of people these days.
And I play the same game. So let's get your life's trajectory. Oh, I want to say, you gave the plenary this morning.
Yeah.
And I told it to you. Now I'll tell it to the world. One of the best talks I've ever attended ever.
Oh, jeez.
And in part because I talk a lot about Tinbergen's 4 questions, and that includes the mechanism question. So a lot of what I do, sort of at the functional level, you've done beautifully added a mechanistic dimension to that, and it's just so exciting. And I'll share some of that excitement during this interview. So the way I want to begin, I know from our conversation that classic textbook, actually an edited book by Krebs and Davies on behavioral ecology, was a pivotal event in your thinking. So why don't you tell us as much as you need to bring us up to that event, and then why that was such a meaningful event, and how that became reflected in your research.
Yeah, well, I've done this early study of hand-holding as a mechanism of sort of what I call the social regulation of emotion. And I had a very specific model in mind when I first did that study. And the model included there was going to be mediation through the prefrontal cortex. And that was because I sort of understood emotion regulation or self-control of impulses as a process that individuals engaged in. They regulated themselves. They regulated their own emotions through this thing. And I had seen in clinical cases that people had, sort of supported each other with touch and supportive behaviors. And I thought that was the way that social support was happening, was that people were activating these self-regulatory circuits. And the bottom line is I didn't find it. And then I went on a fishing expedition for a couple of years trying to find out what the sort of mechanisms were that linked sort of social supportive touch to less threat reactivity in this paradigm that we have that involves putting people under threat of shock in the MRI scanner. And I couldn't come up with anything. I was completely lacking a mechanism. And somewhere along the line, I don't remember the exact sequence of events, but I was giving a talk about this stuff at UVA, where I was a new, freshly minted, brand new assistant professor. And there was a guy there who's become one of my friends and colleagues. His name was Dennis Proffitt. He's an old school sort of Gibsonian perceptual guy, he's into affordances and things. And he said, what if you're barking up the wrong tree? What if there's no mechanism? What if you're thinking about your research all wrong? And the point that he was making is I had thought of this being alone in the scanner facing threat of shock as my baseline reading. And then I was asking people to hold hands with a partner and watching how their threat response was diminished when they were holding hands. That was the experimental treatment. And he said, well, you've got it backwards. Maybe humans are sufficiently social as a species that the hand-holding condition is the baseline, and your experimental treatment is being by yourself in the scanner. And it sort of blew my mind. And I didn't really know how to think about that. And he said, well, I'm going to give you this book. He gave me a copy of this book called An Introduction to Behavioral Ecology by Krebs and Davies. And by this time, I'm a clinical psychologist. I've studied psychophysiology. I've done a lot of observational psychological research, but I hadn't really, really deeply been steeped in evolutionary thinking or ecological thinking since undergraduate school. And I took a class, actually. My first class on sociobiology was from David Barash, who you may know.
Okay, I do indeed know him. Yeah, you had a good individualistic version.
I did, but he was a terrific guy.
Oh, he's a good guy, and of course a gifted writer, and
yeah.
And so hats off to David Barash, you individualistic bastard.
So fast forwarding all these years later, I start reading through Krebs and Davies. And
let me just break in here. That was the book that was in some ways the Bible of behavioral ecology. When did you get this book? What year?
That was 2006.
Okay, so it was maybe 20 years.
Yeah. They hadn't come out with the new edition with the West.
There were multiple editions, but basically the first edition of that book was groundbreaking, and it was adaptationist approach to behavior and other things.
Yeah.
So, and it was a big impact, like a meteor in a way.
Yeah.
At the time, and then and so that's what you encountered.
I think meteoric is the right way to describe its impact on me. I mean, by the time I'd finished the first chapter, I was already thinking about my own work, and indeed thinking about psychology as a broad, discipline completely differently. It starts out introducing principles that organize behavior, that when you give them even a little bit of thought, make complete sense. I mean, so principles like the management of bioenergetic resources, that if you're going to engage in a behavior as an organism to accrue resources, you have to invest resources that you have in store. And that is a very risky business. And so you have to have a certain amount of information about the demand of the environment and your own resource cache. And that entails certain principles that get built into the genome over time about having a surplus and maintaining a surplus so you have to balance your investment against
trade-offs
everywhere. And all of a sudden, I kind of had a personal crisis, like an intellectual crisis, where I thought, holy shit, what have I been doing all this time? I've been thinking about constructs that have no ultimate, they're not tethered to any ultimate goals or any ultimate constraining principles. And so in psychology, sort of anything goes, because they don't have to be constrained by these imperatives of biological organisms across evolution and ontogeny. And then I started going through chapter after chapter after chapter, example after example after example of this set of principles not existing as sort of logical arguments, but as empirical data.
I recall that there were diverse chapters. Some had to do with behavior, as we typically think of it, but others had to do with things like digestion.
Absolutely.
And so one of the messages of adaptationist thinking, basically, is that the way we typically think of as behavior as very flexible in response to the environment also goes for other things, such as life history strategies, physiological strategies, and so on. So it expands the concept of phenotypic plasticity to include behavior plus more.
Oh, completely. Yeah. And this was also one of the things that was also electrifying about this reading experience was that this was nothing at all like my reading of evolutionary psychology that I had done to date. Now, my dissertation was actually a behavior genetic study of a pattern of prefrontal activity associated with risk for depression. So, I was pretty well read in behavior genetic, quantitative genetics. I was pretty well read in evolutionary psychology. I didn't think very highly of it. The standard criticism of just so stories was one problem that I recognized as a legitimate point, but also this sort of radical modularity seemed a little too disrespectful of behavioral flexibility and current contextual demands. And the thing that Krebs and Davies provided was you could say, well, what does the organism need to do? And what are the demands, and how is it going to meet those demands with the resources available? And after several iterations of trying to meet those demands, what is it going to settle on as a kind of a Nash equilibrium kind of optimal solution?
Let me break in there a little bit with a little context, disciplinary context. Outsiders would see something like evolutionary biology as sort of monolithic or actually more unified than it is. And there are separate movements and schools of thought, as there are in many other disciplines. You just mentioned three, and so I'm going to provide background on three. One is behavior genetics, a whole school of thought. Another is behavioral ecology, different than behavior genetics, because it basically doesn't make any assumptions about genetics per se. It's a brand of adaptationist thinking. It simply predicts, how would the organism be structured.
What do they call the phylogenetic gambit?
The phenotypic
phenotypic gambit. That's what it is, yeah.
And then there's evolutionary psychology, which in some ways was a critique of behavioral ecology explicitly, saying that basically that organisms don't evolve directly to behave. They evolve psychological mechanisms that cause them to behave, and that there can be mismatches and so on and so forth. So these are disparate and in some ways warring traditions amongst the evolutionists that you were encountering. You'd have to thread your way through those as somewhat of an outsider.
Yeah, that's true. And my training was really in psychology, so I didn't have a lot of tools to really know how to wind my way through that thicket. But I did have a sort of intuitive sense as a scientist, as a person who was sort of thinking toward the development of theory and methods, that the behavioral ecology approach seemed to me to be the most principled approach. Maybe that's an overstatement. I don't want to disparage people. I mean, but it was the one that resonated with me. The sort of traditional evolutionary psychology approach did not. It seemed to be laden with too many of the same problems that had plagued so many of the islands in the archipelago of psychology, if you will. And also, when it got to things like the phenotypic gambit, these gambits, we're willing to set certain problems aside to try and understand the functional relationship between the organism and the environment.
Gambit, just to be clear to our readers, is that the gambit is to assume that everything is heritable.
Yeah.
And that makes life into a kind of a malleable clay.
Yeah.
And then you make a second assumption that selection has had a long time to work. And so it's that with those two gambits, which are simplifications, then you can predict the properties of organisms based on selection pressures.
Yes.
And it's a good first guess, basically.
Right.
It doesn't have to be true.
It was philosophically, it was epistemologically beautiful to me to include that into the thought process, the scientific process in order to keep forward momentum and understanding how organisms operate.
Yeah. Basically, it's a great first guess. And if you haven't been thinking that way about trade-offs and allocations and so on and so forth, then it's a great first guess because it's definitely going to get you in the ballpark more than other guesses. So anyhow, continue.
Well, so the first thing this did was just sort of blow my mind open in terms of how to understand, how to orient my thinking in terms of psychological questions that the field of psychology broadly had been grappling with up to that time. But then with my own research, I started thinking, well, okay, I sort of designed this funny study that my mom can't believe that I got any money for, because it was putting people under threat of shock and having them hold hands with a supportive partner. And you find that their threat-related activations in the brain are diminished when they're holding hands with their supportive partner as opposed to when they're by themselves.
Or holding hands with a stranger.
Your
mom says they gave you money for that.
They gave you money for that? Why did they give you money for that? Yeah, you should have just talked to me about this. I could have cleared it all up. You wouldn't have to spend all that time and money. And, she had a great point. But of course, the reason that I did that, I knew that was going to happen. But I wanted to know what the mechanisms were. Because somewhere in my dim memory were Tim Bergen's 4 questions. And that's David Barish to thank for that, because that was a big part of that whole thing. And, it wasn't sufficient to me to say, well, great, you hold hands with somebody and you see attenuations in these threat responses that are sort of stereotypical, in a long literature of people putting, pain stimuli or threat stimuli or scary pictures. You see the same kinds of activations in the brain. We see them diminished when you're holding hands. But that wasn't the point. The point is to figure out how it's operating. And
that's the mechanism question.
That's the mechanism question that's so vitally important if you're going to create a multi-level, model of how organisms work. And Krebs and Davies, with this whole conceptual framework that had been developed over decades, many decades, the behavioral ecology framework, gave me something to start with. The first question I asked, given that I was studying social support and reading Krebs and Davies, the first question I asked is, what is the human ecology? And that turned out to be maddeningly difficult to answer. I went through not just Krebs and Davies. I went into the literature. I'm trying to nail down what is the ecology that humans are adapted for. And you must know this is an incredibly difficult question to answer. And as I kept pulling on that thread, the only thing that kept coming up over and over and over again with highly reliably was other humans. And so this is part of what leads to this model that we developed we called the social baseline model, which is that when you average everything out that humans experience over millennia, the only thing that's constant is other humans. We're so adaptable. We've been so many places. We're in the North Pole. We're in the equator. We eat whale blubber and we eat unrefined grains. We live in humid climates and dry climates. We're sort of everywhere. We've been to the moon, practically the bottom of the ocean. The only thing that's constantly there is other people. And I don't think I could have had that insight had I not started depending upon evolution and behavioral ecology as a framework for forming questions and for asking what comes next.
Well, let me take my turn a little bit and explain why I was so bowled over by your work, and then we can, I think, maybe take what I would call a post-enlightenment view.
Okay.
Right, so far we're telling a story about how we became enlightened, and now it would be nice to say, given the fact that we think that we've achieved some kind of insight, then how do we describe the brain and the body from this perspective? And again, I didn't anticipate this, but it is an opportunity to emphasize how much is in formation within the field of evolutionary biology. There's a tendency, a strong tendency in me to explain it as a unified theory, in part like a done deal. But in fact, there's major conceptions of humanity at play. And so even if, for example, you decide that the major part of the human social environment is other humans, even that can go two ways, because those other humans can be adversaries, for example.
Yes.
And in one hypothesis, called the Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis, acknowledges that it's all about social intelligence, but the idea there is that you're competing relentlessly to outmaneuver and outthink the members of your own group. So you're an intensely social species, but you're basically in some kind of a mental arms race with the other members of your group.
Yeah.
But there's a very, very different conception, which is equally social, but much more cooperative and nurturing, which is that, and this I think has become the prevailing view, that in most other primate species, there's a little bit of cooperation and a lot of competition.
Yeah.
And even the cooperation is to create small alliances that compete with other alliances within the same group. And that what made humans, our ancestors, unique was that there were mechanisms evolved that suppressed the potential for disruptive competition within groups, so that between group selection became the primary evolutionary force. So that, of course, is intensely social, but it's social in a way that your social environment is not some big, chess game with other members of your group. It's one in which you can trust other members of your group. And so the default social state is a safe and secure, cooperative, trusting group. And given that, the default mental state and physiological state, the assumption, the default assumption, you might say, of the brain and the body is, I am surrounded with people that are looking out for my self-interest. And deviations from that state trigger various forms of vigilance in the mind and body. So for me, what was an epiphany, you might say, for myself is to, although I've been saying this all along at the functional phenotypic level, that teamwork is the signature adaptation of our species. The idea that this could be reflected in like the default resting state of the mind and the body was a wonderful revelation for me. But maybe you can now take it from here in the post-Enlightenment view and just explain to our listeners what it means for the resting state to be that you are in a safe and secure group, and then deviations from the resting state.
Well, so we kept trying to uncover the sort of mechanisms of regulation by proximity to social resources, and we could never find them. It seemed that the brain was simply less attentive to potential threats. It was less active in regions that have to do with threat vigilance and things like that when social resources were obviously present. And it took a while for me to formulate the idea that this was because when we're in relatively close proximity to social resources, we are in a state that our brain expects to be in, and therefore does not have to respond proactively or reactively to increased sets of demands from the environment. The difficulty I had initially was in understanding that being by yourself might entail more to do. And the reason that was hard for me is because when you're by yourself, there's less sensory stimuli to process. But that's because I wasn't thinking about what humans do, what humans are, to how they're supposed to operate. I was thinking in terms of, sort of psychological operations instead of humans as an organism. And so, we have proposed the possibility that the baseline assumption of the human brain is to be embedded in that trusting social network characterized by shared goals, joint attention, and so on. But then with that in mind, I started really digging into the literature some more. The literature on behavioral economics, game theory, and all of these kinds of things. And you find over and over again this evidence that the default position for humans is to cooperate, to be, sort of aligned with each other, not fight it out, or to, and that seemed to
or even to be very vigilant about cheating and lying and things like that. And,
right. People are very forgiving. The game theory literature makes this really clear, that the optimal game theory solution in things like the prisoner's dilemma, or not prisoner's dilemma, but various
cooperation games of all sorts,
is to assume that the other person is going to cooperate, and when they don't, to forgive one or two or three times before you finally shut them out.
One of the themes of your talk, a new theme for this conversation that I'll introduce now, is that perception of the world is often distorted in ways that are adaptive, basically. We could call them adaptive fictions. And that's been a favorite theme of mine for a long, long time. But once again, your talk added some, mechanistic flesh to those functional bones, and in a way that also ties back to this social theme. So please repeat for the audience this marvelous research. I think it's the research of your friend Denny Prophet, involving estimating the slope of a hill. And just to set the stage, what we're going to encounter here are several things. First of all, adaptive fictions, basically. Yeah. We see the world not as it really is, in a way that makes sense from this behavioral ecology perspective, allocation of resources.
Yeah.
And also in a sense in which the social resources become blended with the personal resources. So all of these are going to be wrapped up in this amazing research about when you're faced in an image of a road leading up a long, long hill, and you're asked to estimate the slope of the hill, what you actually see.
Well, so Denny, who is also, I mean, he's the guy who gave me the book, the Krebs and Davies book to begin with. So he'd already been through this series of epiphanies that I have already been through. And he's also from the sort of the James Gibson tradition of thinking of perception in terms of affordances, which is another way of saying what you were saying already, which is that biological organisms perceive what they need to perceive in order to survive and procreate. I mean, there's a very pragmatic, functional element to perception that surprises a lot of people, surprises me, because you think that you should just perceive everything as it actually is, but that's wasteful. You don't need to perceive everything as it actually is. You need to perceive what you need to use in order to do what you need to do as an organism. And one of the ways that he's illustrated this is by having people estimate the slant of hills. It's really great. He actually brings undergraduates out to actual hills, and he has them estimate the slant by degrees. And what he finds is that people very systematically overestimate the slant of hills. And this makes a lot of sense in a behavioral ecology framework, because the overestimation creates a surplus of personal resources in the sense that it's discouraging us to walk up hills. When we perceive hills to be steeper than they actually are, our brain is sort of saying, yeah, don't walk up that hill unless there's something really terrific up at the top of that hill that you can translate into some great resource, because it's, all things equal, more costly to walk up hills than to not walk up hills.
So let me break in again and actually tie in another example. So of course, it doesn't have to be that way. One possibility is that we can accurately estimate the slope.
Yeah.
And then separately, we estimate the energetic cost.
Yeah.
And so what we could say is that the slope of the hill is what it actually is, but I don't want to go up that hill.
Right.
What actually happens is because you don't want to go up the hill, then you actually see the hill as being steeper.
Yeah.
And let me just tie to another wonderful example from some of our previous research with Kevin Niffin on the estimation of physical attractiveness. In this case, theory tells us that you should be attracted to a partner according to their fitness value. And the fitness value has a physical component, how physically beautiful they are, and a non-physical component, how nice they are, how trustworthy they are, so on and so forth. It's perfectly possible that the way we perceive this is we estimate all of this, and we say, okay, this woman, she gets a 4 for looks, and she gets an 8 for non-physical stuff. All things considered, I like her. That's not how it works. What we do is we fold the non-physical stuff into the physical stuff, and we actually perceive that person as more physically attractive, attractive. And in the case of the slope,
right,
what we're doing is we're folding the economic aspects, and we're not separating it. It's just, that's a fucking steep hill.
Yeah, that's right. And he really drives the point home by having people wear these heavy backpacks. So
the nuances, so the variations of the thing.
He's like, well, let's see if we can move this around. And that's, of course, exactly what you need to do if you're really going to understand how the phenomenon works. And so he has people put on backpacks that are, I think, something like 20% of their body weight. And systematically, the hills become steeper in their reports. The personal resources are taxed, and therefore you're perceiving the world differently, such that your behavior is modified. You require yet more motivation to get up the hill when the backpack is on. What's lovely about this is that it adds to the Krebs and Davies stuff in ways that Krebs and Davies never could, because humans can report what they're experiencing in ways that other animals cannot.
Yeah, that's an asset, and especially when you manipulate it in this way.
Yes, that's right.
More manipulations where you get them to do some exercise, run around a lot, now they're tired.
You can do this all kinds of ways. You can have them run around the block 3 times and they get tired and the hill gets steeper. You can have them fast all day before they come and give the report the hill's steeper.
Heavier
people, higher BMI is associated with a steeper hill. 2008, somewhere around there, Simone Schnall is a postdoc working with Jerry Clore and Denny Profit, and she does a study where she has people stand next to their friends, either with their friends or by themselves with the backpack on. And she finds that standing next to your friend, the hill is systematically less steep.
Less steep. And that makes my point, basically, that the personal resources, what we would think of as the individual resources,
right,
are blended with the social resources.
That's right. That's right. They're blended with the social resources, so that this gives us our first clue that part of the way that humans are organized to construe their environment is that when they are in close proximity to social resources, the bioenergetic capabilities of those social resources outside the physical boundary of our skin, they also belong to us.
And we're hardwired
to factor that in. And because it's a good bet. So we wouldn't be wired this way if that weren't true, right? Because that would make no sense. So we make that prediction because that prediction is probably true.
Yeah, so now let's recapitulate your wonderful talk this morning. We can tell the same story for a completely different set of traits. That would be blood glucose.
Uh-huh.
And to set the stage, glucose is what you described as money.
Yeah.
It's the money of the body. And what you really need in order to any kind of action, you have to spend glucose. And if you're in a threatening situation, then you need to have cash on hand, basically.
Right.
And what that means is that blood circulating in your veins.
Yeah.
If you don't need to spend money, then you can stash the money. And if you need it, it's going to take a little bit of time, basically.
Yeah.
Against that background, the level of circulating glucose is an indication of how threatened you are. Basically, you need the cash in your pocket in order to spend it immediately. And then, like the perception of the hill, then the level of glucose is sensitive to many, many factors, some individual, some social.
Right.
So please add to that story now that I've set the stage.
So bottom line is what we found in an initial sort of exploratory study was that fasting levels of blood glucose, which, as you say, we sort of construed, and this also derives almost directly from Krebs and Davies. They get me thinking in terms of economics. We suggest that if your expectation is that you are going to be confronting problems in the world by yourself, you're going to have to keep a higher concentration of glucose in your bloodstream, because you're going to have to anticipate that you're going to have to invest more money, more bioenergetic money in solving demands, in meeting demands of the environment if you're by yourself. And as luck would have it, there is a field within psychology called attachment theory, particularly adult attachment theory, where there are different sort of attachment styles. And one of the attachment styles that has long been documented, and there's lots of good research about this, is called avoidant. And people who are so-called avoidantly attached, they assume that they're going to be facing life's difficulties by themselves. And there's debate about why that is, but there's not much debate about whether that is the case. There are definitely people like this.
Yeah, let me again provide some more background.
Yeah.
Because this is a whole story in itself. The attachment styles are interpreted starting with John Bowlby, mm-hmm. who was, you could say, one of the fathers of evolutionary psychology.
Yeah, I think so.
Studied how children interact and identified these three styles. And to make a long story short, these have been interpreted as like adaptations to different childhood environments.
Yeah.
And if you're actually growing up in a safe and secure environment as a child, then there's a certain attachment style which is relaxed. You check back with mom, you feel to explore, that kind of thing. If you're unlucky and you have a not a very caregiving environment, Then there's two strategies, basically. One is the clinging strategy.
Yeah.
And the other is the early fledging from the nest strategy. And so these are what adapts you to the childhood environment. And because we're not total chameleons, then these carry over to the adult environment. So how you are as an adult is in part reflected by your childhood environment, and that leaves us with the adult attachment styles.
Right. So the people who are sort of often referred to in this broad literature, one style is this avoidance style that where your strategy in approaching life is to de-emphasize these potential social resources. The theory, which I think is pretty strong actually, is that you've experienced enough, I don't know what you call them, maybe you could call them cheaters.
Betrayals, cheaters.
Enough betrayals and cheaters that you're just going to assume that you're going to have to do it by yourself. And that assumption develops into a preference to being alone because it's stressful to think that someone else might be trying to help you because you don't trust them. And so we thought, well, maybe what if these highly avoidant people have higher fasting glucose levels? And we were doing a bunch of other studies. We had about 60 female undergrads at UVA, and we found indeed a positive association, just a single correlation of about 0.45 or so between attachment avoidance by an adult attachment measure, questionnaire measure, and fasting glucose levels. And I thought it was interesting, but we're still in the hypothesis generation phase. This is not in any sense conclusive. But I gave a talk in Israel a couple of years after that, and I presented these data just to sort of suggest this as a possibility. And a collaborator there who became a collaborator, this guy named Sahi Eindor, just so happened to have access to a very large sample, well, by psychological standards, it's a large sample of about 300 people who were radically different from my undergraduate female sample at UVA. These were 45 to 90 years old, and they were associated with the Israeli military in some way, and they had an attachment measure of avoidance that was different from the one that I had used. It was I don't know exactly where that came from, but they also had fasting glucose levels and a bunch of other measures that we know are associated with glucose, and we found the same association, a positive association between attachment avoidance and fasting glucose levels that was maintained after statistically adjusting for things that are known to covary with fasting glucose levels, like anxiety, DHEA, cortisol ratios, hypertension measures, and so on. So that was pretty amazing, because this felt like I was finally dipping my toe for the first time in behavioral ecology research, because the Krebs and Davies book, over and over again, you get examples of real mechanisms that are associated with these theoretical models of resource allocation. And I felt like we're sort of starting down that road with people now.
Well, why don't we end up with a discussion of what this means in a prevention science and clinical psychology sense? How does this help us understand function and dysfunction in the real world? I mean, I can already see the connections that, of course, so many people in modern life do not exist in safe and secure environments.
No, that's right.
They're out of their comfort zone. They're like the people in your MRI machine. They're threatened all the time. They don't have trusted associates, and so therefore they're going to be spending their money, their glucose money, and their resources with various forms of threat detection and management, which is going to presumably wear and tear on the body and mind, and so on and so forth. So this will have adverse health consequences, mental consequences, social consequences. So again, flush that out for me.
A big part of the big problem in medical care and psychological intervention is that we think of people as individual units and so on. We don't have to worry about their social environments. The social environments are not part of the picture.
They're not on the radar screen.
They're not on the radar screen.
So right away, let's just nail that down, is that we have there's an entire kind of medical paradigm which knows nothing about this. It is clueless with respect to any of what we have been talking about.
The funny thing was that the original design of my hand-holding study that caused this crisis, that caused me to read Krebs and Davies, that caused me to think about things in much more broadly evolutionary and ecological terms, derived from a single clinical case where I was working with a war veteran who could not engage in exposure therapy because indeed, when he finally told his story, I could understand a little bit better. It was absolutely horrific. And he couldn't tell that story without his wife present. And he couldn't tell the story not only without her present, but without her holding his hand. And so that clinical experience sort of urged me to create this study with the fMRI because I wanted to see what was happening. I'm so glad that happened because all of this stuff has fallen out from that single clinical case. And what I wonder is how many clinical situations are like that, where the person who needs that mechanism that's built in, that's hardwired, as you might say, into the way that we operate, it's not being taken advantage of. It's not being utilized. Part of the reason that I study the brain, the neural mechanisms of these kinds of processes now, is because I have noticed that when you tie it to the mechanism, physicians do pay a little more attention. And I think there's some good reasons for that. I mean, if you think about the history of the association between smoking and cancer, for example, people knew that there was an association for a long, long time, decades before any serious social measures were taken to try and do something about it. And the reason for that was that we didn't have a mechanism. People could say plausibly that there could be some third variable. And until we know the mechanism, we can't really know how to intervene. And so part of what we're trying to do now in my lab is really describe what those mechanisms are at the central nervous system level. And my hope is that this will start maybe the process of getting these sort of social regulatory mechanisms taken more seriously.
Yeah, well, it's a good illustration of the fully rounded four-question approach. We actually have touched upon function, mechanism, development, and phylogeny in this talk. So for us, it's like riding a bike. And can be like that for everyone.
Yes.
And but it's going to take a while for everyone, for the field as a whole, for the whole health sciences and so on, to get where we are now. And so anyhow, maybe this interview will help a little bit, nudge people in that direction. So with that, this is awesome. And last night the tables were turned, and I was the one in the hot seat. Together, they make an interesting pair.
Yeah.
And so this was awesome. And so thank you so much.
Thank you, David. Okay, that's it. Hope that was enjoyable. I'll be back again soon when I release episode 11, where I talk with Nicole Prowse. Until then, this is Jim and Lulu Cohn signing off.